Hello, good afternoon, everyone who is joining us after the lunch. My name is Sebastian Rodriguez. I am the founder of Rollout Democracy, and I am also a member of the European Association of Political Consultants. And it is an immense privilege for me as a Spaniard, although I've been living in London for the last 7 years. It's a privilege to me to introduce the panel of today. I think we're very privileged to have these three individuals who are on my left. One of the characteristics of polarized societies is it's very difficult to put people who think differently together and to exchange views. And I think we struck that balance when thinking about the different profiles and journalism. People who have lived in Catalonia, people who have seen, who have looked at Spain, all the situation from the outside. And so I would like to introduce first to AMPARO POLO, who is in the middle. She's a Spanish journalist. Is the UK correspondent of Expansión. Is one of the Spain's leading newspaper for financial news and business. Before that, she was a deputy director of Actualidad Económica, which is is a leading financial business Spanish magazine. And she's been in London for the last 10 years. And her interests cover from politics, business, finance, technology, and she's also been following very closely all the coverage of the Catalan crisis by the international media. She holds a degree in journalism by the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, and holds an MBA at the Instituto de Empresa Business School. RAPHAEL Minder, who is on the opposite side, he has been for 8 years he's based in Madrid, and he has been the New York Times correspondent for Spain and Portugal. He has written extensively on the Spain's financial crisis. I think you arrive at the midst of the financial and all these crises that led to some of the tensions that we are seeing today between the regions. He wrote a book, a really recommended one, The Struggle for Catalonia, Rebel Politics in Spain, and he was born in Geneva, and he has worked for Bloomberg since 1993 in Switzerland, and then he spent 10 years with the Financial Times in Paris, Brussels, Sydney, Hong Kong as the Asia correspondent for the Financial Times. He studied the Politics, Philosophy and Economy, PPE, in Oxford, and holds a master from Columbia's School of Journalism in New York. And last but not least, we have TONI RODON. He is a European doctor by the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. He is currently pursuing a postdoctoral. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the London School of Economics. And before that, he was a postdoctoral researcher in a spatial social science lab at the Stanford University from 2014-2016, and the Department of Political and Social Sciences at Pompeu Fabra, again in Barcelona. He holds a bachelor degree in Political and Administration Science and a master degree in Political and Social Science, both at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. His research interests cover ideology, electoral participation, political geography, and political parties, as well as public opinion and the study of nationalism. And without further ado, I would like each one of them to come here and present their own perspective on the crisis of the the crisis that has been unfolding over the last few months in Spain, more specifically in Catalonia. So I would like first Tony to do the introduction, and then we can continue the chat with Amparo and RAPHAEL. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. As an academic, I prepared a PowerPoint because you know that academics do not know how to do things without a PowerPoint. So, which is over there. Excellent. So let me say first of all that I have a hard task ahead because it's after lunch, and I guess I'll need to motivate you a little bit with a fascinating story, a little bit sad in a personal level, but very interesting in an academic level. When I was first contacted to participate in this conference, basically what the person who contacted me said, he said to me that he wanted me to offer a neutral, impartial account of the Catalan political situation. I already told him that this is basically impossible, essentially because we are all biased in our own way. So what I'm trying to, what I'm going to say in the next 4 minutes, do not take this as an impartial account, but as my own interpretation of what happened essentially in the last months of the last year. So, as I said, the Catalan case is a very interesting one as an academic level. People tend to think that it's unique, and in its own way, it's a unique case because it's difficult to compare to all other cases. But actually, when you look at history, it's not that unique. In a sense, what we have witnessed in the last decades is an increase in the number of states. A lot of states, essentially most of the states, most of the countries that exist nowadays have been created in the last 50 years. So it's not that strange that a region in a particular country tries to pursue independence, because this is something that we have witnessed pretty often in the last decades. The question, though, is that in the world nowadays, we still observe a lot of national minorities. National minorities meaning a group of people within a state that have a different culture, different language, different history, that they feel that they belong to a different group than the state. But the key thing is that most of them do not want independence. Actually, if we count all of them, we only observe that 38% of national minorities in the world want to be independent. And actually, this is a very optimistic percentage. The real one would be actually lower. So the question is, why do we observe the pattern that we observe here in this graph? So this is the territorial preferences among the Catalan population over the last years. As we can see, this comes from surveys, by the way. In 2005, only around 12% of the Catalan population wanted Catalonia to be an independent state. As you can see in the orange line, this increased quite substantially up until 48% of the Catalan population wanting Catalonia to become an independent state. So why do we observe such a pattern? That's the question. So in the academic world, there have been essentially 3 different hypotheses that have been put forward to explain this increase in the secessionist support. The first one tells that Catalans want to become independent due to economic factors. You know that Spain suffered a lot during the economic crisis, the global financial crisis, and the story is essentially that since the Catalans were so hit by the economic crisis, then they all started to desire independence in order to have a more prosperous society. This is the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis that have been put forward by the public, but also by academics, is that independence is essentially explained because of regional elites' strategic considerations. What does that mean? It means that since regional elites do not have the power in the center, they are excluded from the center, they basically switch from wanting to become part of the state to creating their own state. Because if they had their own state, they would have more power. This is a hypothesis that is actually very popular among the Spanish press. It's normally accompanied by the fact by the idea that Catalans are essentially all indoctrinated and manipulated by the Catalan elites who are very corrupt, and then that's why they decide to be independent. The third one, which is actually the one that I'm going to favor, is that the Catalan crisis is basically a result of long-term grievances that have been inflamed by emotionally charged short-term factors. So the first one, the economic explanation, is actually very appealing, because if we look at this graph, this is the evolution of unemployment and the evolution of support for secession in Catalonia. If we eyeball this graph, one can actually conclude very easily that the increase in unemployment caused the increase in support for secession. But as you all know, correlation is not causation, so we need to explore a little bit better this hypothesis. In my own research and research that others have done, we have shown that the economic crisis have had no impact on the increase in secessionist preferences among the Catalans. This is an example of a graph that basically, if there are statisticians in the room, that basically shows the marginal effects of becoming unemployed and the secessionist support, and basically it's null effect. There is no effect. So what about the second hypothesis? The second hypothesis, which is actually something that could be interesting for consultants, says that people think what elites think. And if elites change their opinions, then citizens or the population will change their opinion as well. The problem with this hypothesis is that it also receives very little backing from an empirical point of view. There have been a lot of experiments trying to see whether people change their opinion due to the elites changing their opinion, and they have, and basically the results or the conclusion is that people do not. The only section of the population that change their opinion due to elites changing their opinion are those that feel as Catalan as Spanish, or those that have mixed identities. But of course, elites are diverse, so people basically get pressure from both sides. So normally people are cross pressure, and that's why the majority of them do not change their opinion. So, what is it going on here, according to my interpretation? First of all, according to my view, the Spanish Constitution is a very ambiguous text that can accommodate very different demands. If we compare it to other regions, the Spanish Constitution combines a high decentralization level, high levels of self-government, formally, and high levels of shared government. Shared government is basically the influence of regions on the central state. As you can see, Catalonia scores very high in self-government, but very low in shared government. If we look at the surveys, Catalans basically like that system, but they wanted to have more self-government. This is the preferences for decentralization among Catalans since 1984, and as you can see, those that wanted to have more self-government increased in percentage. But that did not mean that they were more pro-independence. So basically, they wanted more self-government, but they did not want to have their own state. The Catalan institutions tried to change this with a new regional law in 2006. You all know that this was heavily amended by the Constitutional Court in 2010, and that backlashed among the Catalan population, an important portion of them, who basically started to organize different demonstrations. Most of them, you've seen them online and in the TV. So, I'm going to finish this here. So what's my takeaway? The Catalan crisis, or the Catalan political situation, seems very difficult to understand, but it's actually not that difficult to my opinion. It's the classical minority-majority problem in plurinational societies. In plurinational societies, the minorities, even if all minorities wanted to have a certain thing, they will be constantly blocked by the majority if there is no constitutional arrangement that protects them. So, in a way, Spain faces a decision for the future. It can follow the path of nationalization, like other countries. It's very difficult to do it nowadays, but it can try to make all Catalans feel Spanish, or it can try to seek for a federal arrangement that accommodates the majority of Catalan demands. So an arrangement similar to Switzerland, Canada, or other federal institutions in nowadays federal state. The idea here is that the minorities need to feel comfortable enough within the system so that the system accommodates its demands, and And in exchange, the minorities give up the secession instead. So they, as a minority, they do not want to become independent anymore because they know that within the system they can change things. The problem or the dramatic thing in the current political or institutional design is that even if all Catalans decide to do one thing, like 80% of them decide that they wanted a referendum, then they are not able to do it because they are still a minority within the Spanish state. And I think
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be in this panel, as Tony said. As a journalist, it's a very interesting topic, but I have to say that as a Spaniard, it's very sad to be sitting here talking about Catalonia as one of the best examples in the world in terms of polarization. I assume that all of you are highly informed about everything happening in Catalonia and in Spain in the last months. After the last events, you know, we had an illegal referendum, a unilateral declaration of independence, and a regional election again. So after all these events, Catalonia, the Catalan society is completely divided in two halves. One is supporting independence, more or less, and the other one is supporting the constitutional state and the Spanish constitution. So in other words, some people want to be only Catalan and other people want to be Spanish, Catalan, and European. So we can say they have multiple identities and they are proud of being part of several communities. So as a result, there is a fragmented parliament with no government. There are several Catalan politicians living in other countries like Switzerland, the UK, and Belgium. There are 4 politicians in jail accused of rebellion, sedition, and misuse of public funds. And more than 4,000 companies have decided through Catalonia in the last months because of the instability and because of the political uncertainty. So how did we get here is a very complicated question to answer. Especially when Spain has made a massive job in the last 40 years trying to create a new democracy and becoming one of the most centralized countries in the world. So it's true that the relationship between Catalonia and Spain has been always tricky, as Tony explained. That's completely true. And Catalonia has never been an independent kingdom, even if some Catalan historians wants to make up a glorious past and a fake past, in my modest opinion. Maybe Tony has something to say later. But this is a place with a very strong identity, with its own language, and with a very different culture. That's completely true. And this is why the Spanish Constitution in 1978 gave Catalonia the right to autonomy, with total power over health, police, and education, among other matters. So the aspiration of being independent has been always there, and has been always present in part of the population, but always as a minority option. And everything has changed in the last 4 or 5 years, when moderate people who used to support Convergencia, which is now called something nicer, Together for Catalonia, after a lot of scandals and problems inside the party. So all these people who traditionally vote for this party decided to move and to be more close to the independence spirit. So why this radicalization of the independence happened is one of the most interesting topics for journalists and for political science. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the relationship between Spain and Catalonia entered in a new era in the last years, just at the same time that the worst economic crisis hit Spain and burst the property bubble, creating unemployment and austerity and disenchantment with the political and economic elites. And I don't think it's a coincidence either that the explosion of the independence sentiment happened at the same time that populism around the world changed the political landscape. So while some Catalans were demanding independence, other movements wanted to destabilize other countries like Brexit in the UK, and we have other examples in Greece with Syriza, even Podemos in Spain, Le Pen in France, or even Mr. Trump in the States. So there is plenty of room to debate about how the situation reached the point it has. And there is plenty of responsibility to share. Mr. Rajoy, the Spanish Prime Minister, has been ignoring the surge of Catalan separatism for years and didn't listen to the eternal aspiration of managing their own taxes, as the Basque and the Navarros are doing at the moment in Spain. But it's true that the Catalan government staged coup d'etat. I can't find any other word to explain what happened. So, and that meant violating the constitution, Spanish constitution, and also the autonomy statute. So, when the regional Catalan parliament voted in favor of this unilateral declaration of independence, with the support of only 70 out of 135 members in early September, something changed dramatically in Spain and in Catalonia. The last election, held in December, solved very little. The anti-secessionist party Ciudadanos, Citizens, scored a remarkable victory with 25% of the votes, but they are unable to be in charge of the government because of the bloc formed by the three independent parties have the majority. So there is one lesson that we can learn from all this mess is probably that traditional questions like nationhood and sovereignty are still very alive in Europe, even if most of us thought that was something from the past. And I don't think finding a solution is easy. On one hand, you cannot declare unilaterally the independence of a Spanish region in a democratic country inside the European Union, causing pain to families, chaos, uncertainty, and expect nothing to happen. I don't think this is possible. And on the other hand, it looks like a political solution is the only way to come back to normality, even if this term normality is very hard to define. So this is maybe why Spain and Catalonia need a new bunch of politicians willing to resolve this situation.
Well, thank you very much to the conference organizers, to Sebastian, for the introduction. I just wanted to pick up on the points that were made, perhaps. I think, from my perspective, first of all, a lot has happened in Catalonia in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, but actually very little has changed. And it's a striking, if we're discussing polarization, I think it's striking to see the results of the two elections of September 2015 and December 2017 and see, if we look at the blocks, the change is 0.3%. This has been the change. I don't think there's any other country where the politics have been so turbulent and so little has been done in terms of changing the views of the electorate. So it is a deeply entrenched electorate on both sides, where essentially whatever's happened, the middle has kind of disappeared. And people who believed in 2015 one thing probably believe it even more so at the start of 2018 and the other way around. So this is one aspect that I'd like you to consider. There's a whole talk about the silent majority being assumed to be the people who are against independence, but I think the silent majority are the people who actually hate all politics and who've been caught up in this and have had no place to go. The second idea that I think I want to introduce is that the starting point that Catalonia is a problem requires a belief that there are people who want to solve it. And I believe, and this is where I think Tony's point about the elites, I would put more emphasis on it, is important. I believe that the crisis has been very good for the politicians on both sides. And this is the fundamental problem of, or one of the fundamental problems. You have a political arrangement which was in place in the 90s, which meant that no national party at that time in a two-party system could hope to get elected without doing well in Catalonia. No socialist president of the Spanish government ever got elected without winning Catalonia. And in 1996, when the first conservative PP government was formed by Aznar, he had to strike a deal with the Catalans. He didn't get a majority. He had to go to the Catalans and basically do some hard bargaining, a little bit the way Theresa May said to do in Northern Ireland following the last elections. There was no great love, but there was a pragmatic arrangement whereby you scratch my back and I scratch yours, which is exactly what happened when the nationalist, right-wing nationalists of Catalonia ran into trouble and needed the support of the PP, in that case when Pujol was still in power. They got that. The PP voted an extra mandate for Mr. Pujol. They agreed to give more powers to Catalonia. That arrangement has completely fallen apart. So there's a very pragmatic situation where, in the short-termism of modern politics, if you want to win the next election in Spain, you are no longer really fighting it by offering anything to Catalonia. And similarly, a whole generation of Catalan politicians are in power, because nationalism does need an opponent, are in power on this idea that there's nothing to be done with the politicians of Madrid. So it's actually not a lose-lose, it's a win-win just in terms of maintaining yourself in power. And we have seen that have an impact on the national politics of Spain. In 2016, Spain was without a government for most of the year. And the main reason why Rajoy, I think, or one of the main reasons, finally started a second mandate is because Catalonia was a massive obstacle for the parties of the left to agree to form an alternative coalition. They couldn't agree on Catalonia. Catalonia played into the hands of the right. And I think this math is getting more and more dramatic, because in the last elections in Catalonia, the PP, so the party of Mr. Rajoy, was relegated to last. It came last. It's a situation where it is not just underrepresented, it's risking no representation the way things are going. So its incentive to do something about Catalonia is falling. And it's falling even faster because the main party that's now threatening its status at Spanish level is calling for an even harder line on Catalonia, not a softer line, a harder line. Ciudadanos wanted to put in place emergency control of Catalonia long before Mr. Rajoy went ahead with that. So it's a sort of race toward being more and more hardliner on both sides. And that is, of course, not going to create a solution, I believe. The last thing I wanted to say is I do think all the other elements are important, the long-term grievances. I do think the economic element is important, not because of the unemployment figures, but because I think it was a perfect storm that was created. A little bit like what we heard earlier with Brexit, where you can have very different constituents agreeing to meet on a common goal. I lived through this. I do think the message that came from Catalonia was the only positive message in the whole Spanish political landscape around 2011, 2012. Everyone else was saying, tighten your seatbelt. There's nothing good. We're going through a banking crisis. Let's see if we can survive. Comes a message that said, actually, we can do it better. As a standalone republic, we will be doing it better. And I do think the willingness of people to risk change in general, and whether it's Brexit, whether it's Trump, whether it's Catalonia, without knowing for sure the consequences of that change, has gone up massively. And I think that's very important. Despite all the turmoil that we've had, people are willing to risk change. And there's this view of this brainwashing of Catalans. But if you actually look to Catalans who are outside Catalonia, who are in the rest of the EU, including here in Britain, voted once more for independence. 54% of them voted for pro-independence parties in December. And they have, I think, objectively the most at stake, because if there's an independent republic outside the EU, that's a very, very direct impact, possibly, on their lives. But, you know, these people are generally people who are in contact, very much open-minded, in contact with other communities, with other ideas. Yet I think the ideas are more entrenched than ever before. And I've run out of time, and I'm happy if we can continue with questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to take the questions from the floor. Anyone? I do have one. Just to see if that triggers any one of you to raise your own question. But I was thinking, it's all very messy how we got to this place where it's clear that we have a polarized society, but how is this going to end? I mean, how does this end in the long term, and how far the long term is?
Does it work? Well, good question. So I first want to answer something. I'll reply to RAPHAEL, because I just have to say it. So is this idea that the Catalan crisis has been good for both elites? I'm not entirely sure, taking into account that what the Catalan elite is basically in jail, prosecuted by the Spanish state. There are people in exile, and 1,000 people are facing charges. So I'm not seeing why this is good for the Catalan elite. Maybe I got it wrong, but I just don't see it. So what is the solution? I think there is an optimal solution. As I mentioned before, we don't have to create something very, very radical in that sense. You have a lot of institutional arrangements in the world, in plurinational states, that offer an optimal solution for the Spanish model. You have to, or you can create, for example, a federal state with asymmetrical arrangements that protects the self-government of regions. You can do that. You can pursue the way or copy the Swiss model, and then essentially the majority of the Catalan population, and at least in the mid-run, the Spanish population would be happy about it. So that's an optimal solution. Why do the Spanish politicians not apply this optimal solution that have been mentioned several times? I think it's essentially for two things. The first one has been mentioned by RAPHAEL before. It's so the first cause is because of strategic considerations. Going against the Catalans in a broad way gives votes to the main Spanish political parties. So by offering a solution, you're kind of you could be seen as weak, and therefore people would stop voting for you. So there are no incentives to do this, because then you can lose the elections. That's full stop. But this misses an important point, which is the long-term factor, which is the Spanish nationalism. The problem with the Spanish nationalism, Catalan nationalism has problems too, but the main problem with Spanish nationalism is that it does not recognize Catalonia as a country. Catalans, according to the mainstream Spanish nationalism, are basically Spanish people living in the Catalan region. And if you do not recognize that they basically want a different thing, then it's very difficult to solve the situation. Because I agree with what was said, with what was mentioned before, that independence has not a full support in Catalonia. 48% of the Catalan people support independence. But what is true is that what it has not a support from the majority of the Catalans is the status quo. The majority of the Catalans want to change the status quo. But then we bump into the same problem that I mentioned before. Even if all Catalans decided to change the constitution, if the rest of Spain would be against, then the constitution, it would be impossible to change, because there are different political preferences across the different regions. So you need to come up with a way to solve this massive dilemma, which is a minority trying to protect itself. It's not even a homogeneous minority, because not all Catalans want to have that. So a minority protecting itself, and also an institutional arrangement that protects the majority. So by protecting the majority, of course the majority does not have any incentives to change the institution. So to go back to the question, I don't see any solution in the short term. That's it.
I will try to be quicker than you. I'm not very optimistic about the short, medium term. I see a very messy situation for months to come. I see maybe another election in Catalonia, because apparently last election in December didn't resolve anything. And maybe at the end I see a change in the constitution, but this is very tricky. You probably remember that the Spanish democracy is very young, and we had many problems related with terrorism and with military coup d'etat in the 80s. I mean, the Spanish constitution has been made to reject all these dangers in a young democracy. Probably the laws are very strong. Probably the punishment for the Catalan politician has been too much. But the law is saying what it says. So it's difficult for Mr. Rajoy. Some people say, okay, Mr. Rajoy, get all these people out from jail, and it's not so easy for him to do. It are the judges who has to decide what to do in the next months with all these politicians. So probably the most sensible thing would be to reform the constitution and to give more autonomy, if this is possible, which is a little bit, which is possible, to the Catalans, but that means, according to many people, to open a Pandora box. So what will happen with other regions in Spain, like the Basque Country, or like even Aragon? I'm from Aragon. Why not to ask for more autonomy and more independence? Everybody will be free to ask for anything if the Catalans do. So, well, that's my perspective. Not very optimistic, as you can see.
Yeah, I'm not particularly optimistic, but I think there's a greater awareness that both sides have hit the wall. The Popular Party made a a token perhaps, but made a token proposal to reform the constitution in October. So there is a recognition that the constitution, as Tony pointed out, achieved a lot. It was mainly there to ensure the return of democracy in Spain. But the construction, that's actually nothing to do with the constitution. The construction, the political construction that followed, which gave regions autonomy, which is not part of the constitution, created a state where there's a lot of power at regional level without a federal structure. And that probably is the worst of both worlds. On top of that, the powers that were given were not irrelevant, and one of them was education, and I'm a strong believer that once you hand over education, you reshape the thinking of future generations in every country. I went to school in Britain. I learned Napoleon was a crazy tyrant who had to be stopped, and thank God we had two great men, Wellington and Nelson, who did it. I then went to Paris and discovered that he was a national hero, and I was quite surprised. So every country has had that, and it's important. I think the other element is the center. The political center has been lost in Spain. Ciudadanos made a token, again, attempt to occupy the center, and it's now given up on that. We need, I think, the change or the improvement needs to come more at national level than at Catalan level, with some parties, some political force, maybe existing or future, seeing an opportunity in regaining the center with concrete proposals. I mean, part of the drama of Catalonia is that a few years ago, we were talking about actual facts and figures, about money, about building, finishing a railway line, adding more flights into Barcelona. We've stopped talking about anything factual. No one for the last 2 years has even explained to me or to the Catalan people or to anyone what kind of republic they want, partly because they themselves would have such different visions of exactly what republic they would have. So maybe we can return to that. That's one, and I think the last point I would say that could be relevant is, I think, is essentially the uncertainty might start just weighing on the economics and influence of the debate. This is not, politically I was making the case that this is good news. Economically, this has not been good news. Not good for Spain, definitely not good for Catalonia, hidden by the fact that it's taking place within a very broad recovery. But let's see what happens if there's the next financial crisis, Europe-wide financial crisis. How would Spain be able to cope with that, with the political crisis that it has at present?
So I think we have a question.
Yeah, a couple of sort of comments and questions. 2 years ago, when I was doing research in Catalonia, the single best message for the independence movement was all our money is going to Madrid. And that's why we need to have independence. Is that still a message which has resonance? Because what it did ultimately is build far more sense of, call it Catalonian pride. And then the third question is, really in many ways, when we started looking at the research over since the last 2 years, that the bête noire of Rajoy has in fact increased the sense of Catalonian independence, because he has been so vociferous against it and appearing to be so opposed to it that it has created even greater intensity in the independence movement. I'm just curious about your reactions.
Who wants to take that up? So the first one, the message around Spain ropes us.
I think one of the myths, if you like, or the points that has been kind of burst in the last 2 years is this idea that independence necessarily creates more prosperity. The facts have played against that, but the relevance of that is not very high. I think this has become such an emotional debate that I know a lot of people who are willing to accept the cost of independence. Before it was a more pragmatic approach, now it's just, if there's a cost, I'm prepared to pay. On your second point, yes, Rajoy has helped polarize, but let's be careful about that. I personally think Rajoy is a relatively moderate person in general. He's an extremely cautious man. There's a lot of people with harder views on what to do in Catalonia, not just within his party, who could have been in charge and taken tougher measures. So I'm not sure that removing Rajoy means the next person is a softie.
Concerning your question about España no roba, which is Spain is still in, well, the Catalan government has been very good making this kind of slogans and making demonstrations, beautiful demonstrations on the street. You have seen the pictures. It's amazing. Barcelona was like a party, and they were asking for independence, which is kind of miracle. So, and I think to say that Spain is still in is a very well common slogan. In Italy, they have Roma ladrona, which is another American famous slogan. So even kids at the school repeat this sentence, which is not completely true, of course, but is one of the main victories of the Catalan government is to win this kind of messages.
Well, kids in the school repeat that. Yeah, we also beat them up if they speak in Spanish. We do terrible things in the schools. Yeah, it was certainly part of the political message. It was not a majority, I would say. That was a slogan put forward by a very minor party called Solidaritat Catalana in 2010, I think it was. If you ask Catalans why they want to be independent in surveys, essentially what they say is that a different country would be good in order to govern themselves, have higher prosperity, manage their own power, their own finances, to be more open to the world, and so on and so forth. Only 10% of them mention identity-related issues. So in a bit is what RAPHAEL mentioned. It's basically a big bag where, in which everyone puts something in it. Everyone has its own idea of independence. The second part, Rajoy is a moderate, I agree, as compared to what can come in the future. So imagine what can come. But I think, and in order to be a little bit more optimistic, if Rajoy or the Popular Party loses the elections, that could be a good thing for the Catalan issue, at least in the short term, because it would provide a little bit of change in the short term, and it would appease things, maybe not, but I would like to think it would appease things a little bit for the next 1 or 2 years.
And on that more optimistic tone, I would like to ask a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much.